He smiled for the cameras. He toyed with the reporters. He sat in courtrooms pleading the fifth with a cigarette hanging from his lips, blowing smoke at the people who clung on to his every word. Are you also known as a racketeer and gangster? I respectfully declined to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me. What labor organization or unions are you now associated with? I respectfully declined to answer because I honestly believe my answer may tend to incriminate. In the 1960s and 70s, no gangster in New York fascinated the public more than Crazy Joe Gallo. He lied to judges, mocked prosecutors, and treated subpoenas like invitations to perform. He was young, fearless, unpredictable, a man who didn't just defy the mafia, he attacked it. From his base on President Street in Brooklyn, Gallo built a crew that behaved less like a neighborhood gang and more like a guerrilla army. A crew that kidnapped, made men, shot up social clubs, and dragged the Colombo crime family into a civil war unlike anything the American Mafia had ever seen before. A war that climaxed with the public shooting of his own boss at Columbus Circle. A hit that stunned New York and humiliated the Cosa Nostra. To the press, he was a charismatic outlaw. To the public, especially in Brooklyn, he was a hero. But to the Mafia, he was a walking nightmare. This is the story of the war between the Italian Mafia and Crazy Joe Gallo, the mobster who started a civil war. Crazy Joe was born Joseph Gallo on April the 7th, 1929, in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, New York, a waterfront neighborhood on the western edge of the borough built on a peninsula that juts into the upper New York Bay. Bounded by the Gowanus Canal to the east and the harbor to the west and south, Red Hook sat in the shadow of the Brooklyn docks, a maze of cargo piers, tugboats, freight terminals, and cavernous warehouses that made it one of the busiest and one of the most dangerous shipping districts in the city. Life here moved to the rhythm of the waterfront. The smell of salt water mixed with coal, smoke, diesel, and the warm scent of bread drifting from corner bakeries. Ship horns echoed off the brick tenements every morning, and longshoremen lined the piers, waiting for their names to be called by hiring bosses who could make or break a man's week with a single gesture. For a boy like Joe, the harbor wasn't scenery. It was the backdrop of daily life. But the docks were never peaceful. Only a few years before Joe's birth, these same piers had been the battleground of a violent struggle between the old Irish White Hand Gang and the rising Italian Black Hand Gang led by Frankie Yale. The White Hand had controlled the waterfront since the 19th century, a rough fraternity of longshoremen, saloon enforcers, and pier bullies under volatile leaders like Pegleg Lonergan and Wild Bill Lovett. Men who fought brutally to keep the docks in Irish control. The Italians, though, were arriving in boatloads and gaining ground. Frankie Yale's Black Hand operation was disciplined, ambitious, and increasingly well-connected. Through extortion, targeted assassinations, and pressure on shipping companies, Yale's men slowly eroded that Irish control. By the mid-1920s, after the murder of Wild Bill Love in 1923 and Pegleg Lonergan in 1925, the Irish stronghold finally collapsed. The White Hand vanished almost overnight, their legend becoming just another waterfront tale, and the Italians claimed the piers. This was the world that Joseph Gallo was born into. A waterfront still marked by the fading Irish grip, the growing strength of the Italians, and a level of tension that never fully disappeared. Mornings smelled of salt water and diesel. Afternoons could turn violent without warning, a fight on a pier, a knife in a bar, or a body turning up in the Gauss Canal. But the end of the Irish-Italian waterfront war didn't end the violence or the extortion. The Italians had simply stepped into the vacuum that the Irish left behind. Just like their predecessors, they preyed on their own people, sending Black Hand letters to Italian shopkeepers and laborers who refused to pay tribute. Threat stamped with the outline of a severed hand, hence their name, and the shakedowns didn't stop at storefronts. Most Italian immigrants in Red Hook worked on the docks, fresh off the boats, and desperate for steady wages. Hiring bosses and Italian enforcers routinely skimmed 25% of a man's pay, and refusal meant a beating, a broken arm, or worse. It was a world where poverty and fear walked hand in hand. Joe's parents, Umberto and Mary Gallo, were among the thousands of southern Italians who crossed the Atlantic searching for something better. They came from Torre del Greco, a fishing and coral crafting town near Naples that lived in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Like so many families from the Italian South, they left behind poverty, overcrowded housing, and an economy that offered little more than seasonal work and shrinking wages. They boarded a steamship in Naples with everything they owned packed into a handful of trunks. The journey took nearly 2 weeks across the Atlantic, cramped bunks, cold air, and the constant roll of the sea, until at last the ship slipped into New York Harbor. From the deck, they would have seen what millions saw before them, the Statue of Liberty rising out of the mist like a promise, and behind it the low skyline of Manhattan. And like the millions who had seen that same image before them, they had hope in their hearts. Their first steps in America were taken at Ellis Island, where they joined the long lines of hopeful immigrants being inspected, processed, and then given the chance to start again in the Promised Land. Once cleared, they followed the path so many Italians had taken before, across the East River and into Brooklyn, where friends, relatives, and familiar dialects crowded the tenements of Red Hook and Carroll Gardens. But when Umberto arrived in Brooklyn and saw the reality of the docks, the kickbacks, the threats, the constant danger, he wanted no part of it. He wasn't built to gravel for work or bow to a peer boss, and that stubborn streak would later show up in all 3 of his sons. So when an opportunity arrived in January 1920, he grabbed it with both hands. Prohibition had begun. The 18th Amendment, the law that ushered in prohibition, outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol across the United States. But lawmakers hadn't changed the country's drinking habits. They'd simply pushed them underground and by doing so given organized crime the opportunity of a lifetime. Americans weren't going to stop drinking just because the government told them to. And that meant that overnight liquor went from a legal commodity to a black market gold mine. Every bar, club, and restaurants in New York needed suppliers willing to break the law. And the men who were prepared to step into that void could earn more in a single bootlegging run than a longshoreman could in months of back-breaking labor. To Alberto, the illegal liquor trade offered what the docks never could: independence, money, and a chance to rise without answering to anyone. A man with a car, a connection to a smuggler, and the nerve to drive fast through Brooklyn's darkened streets could build a small empire. And unlike the waterfront, where Italians were treated like second-class workers, the bootlegging networks were wide open. Success went to whoever took the risk, and Umberto stepped quietly into that world and never looked back. By the time that his first son, Larry, was born in 1927 at the family home in Red Hook, Umberto Gallo was making his living as a bootlegger, supplying liquor to speakeasies from Red Hook to Bensonhurst. He ran whiskey in from New Jersey, bought off beat cops when he could, and outran them when he couldn't. By the time Joey was born in 1929, Umberto controlled 6 trucks and was moving booze for several big hitters in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And when his third son, Alberta, arrived in 1930, Umberto had made a small fortune, and he was going to need it. Here's the big moment. Acting Secretary of State William Phillips is signing the 21st Amendment, and prohibition is repealed. The government finally admitted the obvious, that banning alcohol had been a catastrophic mistake, one that handed organized crime the money, power, and structure it had never possessed before. It gave the underworld a blueprint that men like Joe Gallo would later inherit, and as politicians toasted the return of legal liquor, thousands of small-time bootleggers vanished overnight. But Umberto did what the smart survivors did. He funneled what remained of his profits into loan sharking and small street rackets, keeping the money flowing and keeping himself useful. Still, the violence on the docks, the endless feuds, the killings, and the growing pressure from Italian crews who were replacing the old Irish system became too much. The waterfront was tightening, becoming more controlled, more political, more dangerous, and Umberto had 3 young sons to raise. He didn't want to raise them next to all of that. So, he did something rare for that era. He stepped back, using what he'd saved from bootlegging. In 1934, he bought a modest restaurant in the quieter Kensington neighborhood, a greasy spoon called Jackie's Charcoal at 108 Beverly Road. It was the kind of place where laborers came for eggs and coffee, where neighborhood gossip flowed louder than the percolator, and where a man with the right connections could still run a quiet loan operation from a back booth, which of course did. The Gallo lived nearby at 639 East 4th Street, in a neighborhood that in the 1930s was still finding its identity. Kensington sat at the crossroads of several immigrant enclaves, Irish, Jewish, and Italian, each group carving out its own block, its own church, its own corner store. It was a place of narrow tenements, candy shops, and smoky pool rooms, where kids played stickball in the street and learned early how to fight for respect. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, or at least safer than the docks. And it was there, against the backdrop of frying pans, cigarette smoke, and whispered deals, that young Joey Gallo and his two brothers spent the earliest years of their lives. The Great Depression had hit Brooklyn hard. Work was scarce, and for many, the easiest money came from numbers games, petty rackets, or running errands for the local mobsters who seemed to command both fear and admiration. Kensington was rough, not in the cinematic sense of gangland warfare, but in the grinding day-to-day survival of families who had to make do with little. There was a code on the streets, a mix of pride, toughness, and silence, and young Joe absorbed it all. The Gallo boys were close in age and temperament, each one restless, quick with their fists, and even quicker with their tempers. Joe, with his pale blue eyes and light brown hair, stood out immediately. Neighbors began calling him Joey the Blonde, a nickname that followed him throughout his youth. By their early teens, Joe, Larry, and Albert had formed their own little crew on the streets. Joined by friends like Pete, the Greek Diapoulos, and Frank Punchy Iliano, they turned the Ace Pull Room on Church Avenue into their unofficial headquarters, a smoky, dim-lit clubhouse where they ran small-time rackets, pool sharking, petty robberies, and whatever else brought in a few dollars. In many ways, they were mirroring their father. At Jackie's Charcoal, Umberto ran his modest diner like a neighborhood social club, just like the ones you've seen in the films. The front room served bacon and eggs, and the back room was where cash changed hands. IU's was settled, and quiet business took place among men who kept one hand on their coffee and the other near their coats. Joe grew up in that world, surrounded by gamblers, hustlers, and the kind of working-class wise guys who taught lessons with a look instead of a lecture. For the Gallos, stepping into that back room when Alberto allowed it was its own kind of apprenticeship. Despite the little street operation the boys had going on, Joe's intelligence was obvious early on. Teachers at public school 179, his elementary school on Avenue C, described him as sharp but undisciplined, clever, observant, interested in literature, arts, and quick to learn, but uninterested in rules or authority. He later enrolled at the Brooklyn High School of Automotive Trades in Williamsburg, but by 1945, at the age of 16, he dropped out entirely. By then, his education had already shifted from classrooms to the streets, from textbooks to pull halls, racetracks, and the back room of Jackie, where he learned more about human nature, leverage, and loyalty than any teacher could ever offer him. That same year, Joe was involved in a serious car accident that left him with a head injury and a permanent nervous tic. Doctors later described him as suffering from severe restlessness and mood swings, symptoms that made him unfit for consistent work. They said for a young man already inclined towards rebellion, the diagnosis only pushed him further to the edges of society. And for boys like Joey, those edges were exactly where they seemed to thrive, because Brooklyn in the late 1940s was a world of its own, a patchwork of small-time gamblers, loan sharks, bookmakers, and political fixes who operated under the quiet but unmistakable influence of the Profaci crime family, the dominant mafia power in South Brooklyn. At the top sat Joseph Profaci, a man as wealthy as he was feared. He ruled not with street swagger, but with the calm authority of a Don, the kind of presence cinema would later capture in Don Corleone from the Godfather movies. Profaci was the real-world model of that kind of Don. Dignified, deeply Catholic, soft-spoken in public, and utterly ruthless behind closed doors. They called him the Olive Oil King because he was the largest importer of olive oil in America, a legitimate empire that provided the perfect cover for his criminal one. He had ruled South Brooklyn since the 1930s, building a mafia family that prized obedience above everything. Profaci demanded strict discipline from his soldiers. And he also demanded a tax on every racket, a tribute on every dollar earned, a cut of every operation. In the old Sicilian expression, he insisted on wetting the beak, taking his share from anyone doing business on his territory, whether they liked it or not. Profaci was a greedy boss, and the Gallos were on his radar. But Joey the Blonde wasn't ready to fully succumb to the life of organized crime just yet. In 1946, he briefly joined the U.S. Navy, perhaps out of a desire for purpose, or maybe just to escape the monotony of Brooklyn life. But the structure of military life didn't suit him. During the induction, he refused to answer key questions, and within months he was discharged after psychiatrists at the Great Lakes Naval Hospital declared him unfit for service due to a nervous restlessness and instability. Back in Brooklyn, Gallo seemed to drift, but the drifting was deceptive because beneath the surface there was a deeper current carrying him forward. It was a mixture of imagination, restlessness, and a fascination with the myth-making world of American crime. See, young Joey was by nature a dreamer, and for a boy raised in a neighborhood that was quite literally shaped by hustlers, dock workers, and fugitives, dreaming often meant reinventing yourself, as well, someone larger than the narrow streets around you. And as teachers noted, he loved music, movies, and art, and spent hours in local theaters studying the way that gangsters were portrayed on screen. And there was one film in particular that stood out to him. When Joey saw Richard Widmark's chilling portrayal of Tommy Udo in the 1947 film Kiss of Death, it wasn't simply entertainment. It became a blueprint. Widmark's unhinged laugh, that eerie, childlike cruelty, the unnerving charisma that made violence feel theatrical, Joey absorbed it all. He practiced the laugh, mimicked the dialogue, and slipped the mannerisms into everyday conversation. Friends later said that he didn't just imitate Tommy Udo. He seemed to be studying him, trying him on like a suit. For Joe, the line between performance and identity had already begun to blur. He wasn't imagining himself as a thug. He was rehearsing for his future role as the charismatic outlaw, the gangster who didn't just commit crimes, but performed them. And whilst Joey was building this internal mythology, his older brother Larry, 2 years his senior, was carving out a far more practical path on the streets of South Brooklyn. He had stayed at the Ace Pool Room, building the burglary rackets with the crew, and had caught the eye of one man in particular, Francesco Abbatemarco, known as Frankie Shots, and one of the most well-connected figures in Brooklyn's underworld, and a man who frequented Jackie's charcoal. Frankie Shots was an old-school gangster in the truest sense, a man who had earned his position through the gold mine of prohibition and kept it through a mix of charm, violence, and business sense. His numbers racket alone, a kind of illegal lottery on the streets, generated nearly $2 million a year, which in 1947 is nearly $30 million today. His loan sharking and gambling operations stretched across bars, candy stores, and social clubs from Bensonhurst to Carroll Gardens. He had a reputation for treating his men well, for maintaining discipline without unnecessary brutality, and for understanding which young recruits were worth grooming. Frankie Shots wasn't just a neighborhood tough. He was a caporegime in the Profaci crime family, a title that carried considerable weight. In the structure of the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian-American Mafia, the hierarchy resembled a pyramid. At the top sat the boss, beneath him the underboss, and beneath them the caporegimes, men who were entrusted to run entire crews, territories, and revenue streams. They commanded soldiers, managed rackets, and answered only to the family's highest leadership. And the reason Frankie held such a prominent position was simple. His operation produced exactly the kind of steady, dependable money that attracted the eye of the greedy Joe Profaci. Every profitable racket in South Brooklyn eventually found its way onto Profaci's books, and Frankie Schatz was one of his biggest earners. In a family where greed flowed downhill, Frankie delivered and Profaci rewarded earners. Larry Gallo impressed Frankie Schatz immediately. He was loyal, steady under pressure, and crucially came with two brothers and his own small crew who shared his fearlessness and appetite for risk. Frankie Schatz's decision to take Larry under his wing pulled the other two Gallo brothers with him. Joey and Albert committed themselves to the life, and together the Gallo boys began to flourish inside the world that had once been just background noise. Under Frankie Schatz's guidance, the Gallo brothers began stepping deeper into the Profaci family's Brooklyn operations. They became known simply as the Gallo boys, three inseparable brothers who moved through South Brooklyn as a single unit, gaining a reputation for reliability, nerve, and an uncommon willingness to take on the jobs that other young soldiers would have avoided. Whether it was beating up borrowers who fell behind on Frankie Schatz's loans or reminding numbers runners not to skim from the bank, the Gallos handled the work quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation. Their growing presence did not go unnoticed, and before long Frankie Schatz recommended them to a far more powerful figure, Anthony Tough, Tony Anastasia, the man who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront, and not to mention the brother of one of the most feared and influential mobsters in the whole of the United States, Albert Anastasia. For the Gallo boys, three young street operators who'd grown up watching the docks from a distance, this was something entirely different. This wasn't just an introduction, it was an ascension. Because Albert Anastasia wasn't simply another gangster. By 1949, he stood near the top of American organized crime. As one of the architects of Murder Incorporated, he helped oversee the Mafia's nationwide enforcement arm, the syndicate of contract killers who carried out hits for families from New York to Chicago. The newspapers called him the Lord High Executioner, and for once the headlines were not exaggerating. His name carried weight everywhere, whispered in barbershops, muttered in police precincts, and spoken cautiously in political circles. Even other mobsters watched their tone around him because they knew exactly what he was capable of. When Albert walked into a room, conversations dropped to a murmur. He was regarded as one of the most dangerous men of his generation. Unpredictable, ferocious, and utterly indifferent to public opinion. His influence extended far beyond Brooklyn. He had ties to the National Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, long-standing relationships with figures like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, and a reputation for swift, uncompromising violence that intimidated entire cities. Over the 2 decades since the final blows of the old white hand-black hand conflict, Tough Tony and Albert Anastasia had transformed the Brooklyn waterfront into their own private empire. After crushing what was left of the Irish-controlled White Hand Gang in the 1930s, Tony and Albert consolidated power with an iron grip, turning the docks into one of the most profitable criminal operations in New York. The hiring halls, the unions, the stevedore companies, the unloading crews, the kickbacks, the rackets. Every dollar that passed through the waterfront passed through the Anastasia first. Nothing moved on the docks unless they allowed it to. And anyone who challenged that near-total monopoly paid dearly. The clearest example of this came in 1939, when Italian longshoreman Pete Panto rallied nearly 1,000 dock workers against the corruption that was squeezing him and his colleagues dry. For a brief moment, it looked as though the workers might finally break free of the Mafia's grip. But Panto's courage lasted only a few months. One summer night, he vanished without a trace, strangled on Albert Anastasia's orders and buried in a lime pit in New Jersey. His death sent a message that echoed across Brooklyn. The waterfront did not belong to the unions or the workers. It belonged to the Anastasia. This was the world the Gallo brothers stepped into, a world where a recommendation from Frankie Schatz now placed them under the direct patronage of the Profaci crime family, a family whose influence stretched from Red Hook to Midtown and all the way to the Commission itself. And once the Gallo boys walked on to those docks, there was no turning back. Their steady work, running errands, and handling the rough jobs for Tough Tony soon earned them something more permanent on the waterfront. Together, the brothers were placed in charge of collecting the daily tribute from longshoremen, the quiet but relentless flow of cash that moved up the chain to Tough Tony himself and ultimately to Albert Anastasia. It was a bitter irony. These were exactly the kind of men that their father, Umberto, had refused to kneel to. The very reason he had turned to bootlegging during Prohibition, rather than spending his life on the docks, handing over his wages to enforcers, to ensure no longshoremen slipped past without paying tribute. They set up their base inside the Longshore Restroom Room at 77 President Street, a shabby but strategically placed building just a few doors down from their grandmother's tenement building at 51 President Street. The restroom quickly became their unofficial headquarters, a place where they gathered information, collected payments, and established themselves as permanent fixtures on the Brooklyn waterfront. And the waterfront in turn shaped them. Tough Tony must have had 100 scams running at any given moment, ranging from kickbacks to counterfeit union fees. One of his most notorious operations was the mandatory barbershop racket, where longshoremen were required to pay for haircuts in advance at a union-backed barbershop, which was also on President Street, even if they never walked through the door. The scam was simple, brazen, and wildly profitable. And the Gallos were put in charge of this racket as well. With money coming from both Frankie Shots and Tough Tony, the brothers began branching into rackets of their own. From the back room of the Longshore Restroom, they pushed jukeboxes into bars and restaurants across Brooklyn and Manhattan, including Frankie and Johnny's Steakhouse on West 45 Street, the Luna Restaurant on Mulberry Street, Red's Pizzeria in Borough Park, and Cardiello's Tavern on 4th Avenue. They expanded into rigged pinball machines, rigged to swallow coins without ever paying out, and they began hijacking trucks, a job Joe embraced with a mixture of enthusiasm and mischief. Hijacking made him feel alive. Fun and money, he'd later say that was the appeal. And then came the move that showed just how ambitious the Gallo operation had become. By the early 1950s, jukeboxes weren't just a decoration. They were one of the most dependable cash businesses in New York. A single machine could pull in hundreds of dollars a week, and in the right bar, thousands of dollars a month. All of it arrived in loose coins. None of it was recorded. And because every neighborhood bar, diner, luncheonette, and pizzeria needed one, the fight to control those machines became a quiet turf war across the city. Whoever controlled the jukeboxes controlled a river of untraceable cash, and the Gallos understood this instinctively. So in 1950, instead of getting involved in that turf war and fighting over each machine one location at a time, they did something far smarter. They institutionalized their rackets. They paid roughly $90,000, about $1.10 million today, to charter Jukebox Union Local 266, a supposed labor union organization for jukebox operators. In reality, it was a mob-made cartel designed to give the Gallo brothers total control over the jukebox trade. Membership to the union became mandatory for any business that they targeted in Brooklyn and New York, and once you joined, you were bound to follow the union's rules written entirely by the Gallos. Only union-approved jukeboxes could be installed, which obviously meant only machines belonging to the Gallo brothers. Contracts promised a neat 50-50 split of the profits. But in reality, the brothers took whatever percentage that they wanted that day. And if a bar owner refused to join or tried to operate independently, the message arrived quickly. Their machine was smashed up, their windows suffered a similar fate, or a late-night visit from Larry, Joey, or Albert delivering a warning that the business might accidentally go up in flames tended to ensure compliance. Even rival crews knew better than to test Gallo turf. If another gang tried to place their machines in Gallo territory, union representatives, which simply meant Galloing forces in union jackets, removed them by force. The brilliance of the scheme was its simplicity. By disguising extortion as a labor union, the Gallos transformed a street-level shakedown into something that looked on the surface like regulated commerce. To an outsider, it was just business. To the Gallos, it was a gold mine. Bars got music. The brothers got a constant, reliable flow of money, and because the income arrived coin by coin, night after night, it left almost no trace. A perfect racket for a crew that understood the value of cash that never made its way onto a ledger. It was elegant, profitable, and perfectly suited to the brothers' style because it was half legitimate, half criminal, but completely effective. That union alone made the Gallo crew one of the most profitable young outfits operating under either Frankie Shots or Tough Tony Anastasia. And beyond hijacking street shakedowns and the theatrics Joe Gallo loved so much, it showed something deeper. It showed that the Gallo were thinking long-term, that they weren't just muscle. They were actually building an empire. And to build that empire, the brothers needed some help. By the end of 1950, the Gallo gang boasted around 25 members, most notable of which, alongside the brothers, were longtime enforcers Pete the Greek Diapoulos, Frank Punchy Iliano, and his cousin Armando Iliano, or Mondo the Dwarf as the crew called him. Larry's bodyguard, Joe Gioli, though the crew just called him Joe Gioli, and he was the most trusted hitman of the crew after the brothers. Also filling the ranks was Nicholas Biano, Bobby Borello, Vic Musso, Michael Rizzatello, Joe Magnasco, Tony Ortolano, Louis Maranzano, who was known as Cadillac Louis, and even Hassan Wafer, Joe's Egyptian bodyguard, who was known as Ali Baba. They were a young, volatile, and dangerous coalition, the next generation of Brooklyn gangsters. Around this time, Frankie Shots paired Larry with another promising young gangster, Carmine Persico, to help manage his expanding numbers and loan-sharking rackets, and the Gallo crew gained another valuable member. Persico and the Gallo formed an immediate bond, hijacking trucks together, robbing bookmakers, shaking down rivals. They were reckless, ambitious, and brutally efficient. And by the early 1950s, they were widely considered the top enforcers in Frankie Shots' crew. Joe, however, remained the strangest out of all of them. It was around this time that he earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Crazy Joe. President Street was quickly becoming their fortress, where the whole Gallo crew were omnipresent night and day. This picture shows Mondo the Dwarf, Umberto Gallo, and Tony Bernardo outside the Longshore restroom. And truth be told, the restroom was becoming a little small for the whole gang. So in 1955, the brothers opened a quieter headquarters a few doors down at 51 President Street, establishing the direct vending machine company on the ground floor of their grandmother, Nunziarta's 3-story tenement. It was a clever front, a fully legitimate business that allowed them to funnel mob profits into real contracts. Larry personally negotiated distribution rights with the vendor company of Glen Cove, securing exclusive South Brooklyn and Long Island placement for their new pre-mixed soda machines. Within a few years, the Gallos controlled everything from the jukeboxes that played the neighborhood's music to the soda machines that served its workers, and the cash flowed constantly. At the same time, Frankie Shots' numbers business was booming. Albert, now known as Kid Blast, not for his marksmanship, but his reputation and performance with the ladies, ran the racket with Carmine Persico, enforcing collections with an iron fist. The brothers also oversaw Frankie Shots' loan-sharking operation, and it was here that Joey the Blonde would become Crazy Joe Gallo. Joe purchased a female mountain lion from an exotic animal seller in Manhattan and kept her in the basement of his grandmother's tenement building on President Street. I mean, you can see why this guy got the nickname Crazy Joe. So he named the lion Cleo, and she's photographed here with Tony Ortano inside a police station. I mean, it's a surreal image that captures the bizarre charm and menace of Joe Gallo and his crew. Mondo the Eck, which was his name on the streets, not what I'm calling him, was put in charge of looking after Cleo, feeding her nothing but raw meat on Crazy Joe's strict instructions. But Cleo wasn't a pet. she was a message. When debtors stalled or refused to pay Frankie shots, Cleo was brought out as a reminder of who they were dealing with. And if anyone in Brooklyn doubted the stories, he's pictured holding a young Cleo here with Mondo as they're walking it through Brooklyn. Joe would walk the lion through the streets himself, making it clear that whatever he kept in the basement of 51 President Street wasn't myth or folklore. He really had a lion. People started calling him Crazy Joe at this point, and for once, the mob nickname didn't need explaining. The laugh, the violence, the theatrics, the lion, it all fit, because word spread fast that when Crazy Joe came looking for money, you paid immediately. Understandably, repayment shot up, and Crazy Joe became the single most feared enforcer in the entire crew. With a chokehold on the longshore men for Tough Tony, and a booming jukebox, gambling, vending, and loan-sharking racket, the money was pouring in. And that kind of steady cash flow always attracted the attention of Joe Profaci. Inside the Profaci family, capos debated whether the Gallo brothers were suitable to become made men. Some admired their nerve, their discipline, and the sheer money that they were generating. But others were deeply unsettled by Joe's odd quirks, his intense stare, his unpredictable humor, his eccentric mannerisms. He was brilliant, fearless, and to certain old-timers, unnerving. They were also concerned about the interracial nature of the Gallo crew. Profaci was old school. He had ruled the family since the end of the Castellamarese War in 1931, and he had been raised in the era of the mustache petes, the rigid traditionalist who believed only Sicilians belonged anywhere near the Mafia. The Gallo brothers, and Joe in particular, didn't care about any of that. They judged recruits on one thing and one thing only: loyalty. If you could earn, and you stood with the Gallos, you were welcome in the crew. Despite their unusual circle of friends and questionable fits with Mafia tradition, reputation wins wars, and the Gallo reputation was impossible to ignore. In early 1956, both Larry and Joe were finally given their buttons. They took the ancient blood oath of omertà and were formally inducted into the American Mafia. They were now what the underworld called made men, protected, respected, and untouchable. Two of the three brothers had climbed from Kensington street kids to sworn members of the Preface crime family. For Larry, it was the fulfillment of everything the brothers had worked towards. They were still only soldiers, the lowest formal rank on the Mafia pyramid, but soldiers with money, influence, manpower, and a growing network that stretched across Brooklyn. The Gallo brothers were no longer just neighborhood toughs. They were a force in New York City, and they were about to be given their very first task. That task arrived in October 1957, when the criminal underworld trembled with the news that someone had murdered Albert Anastasia, the feared Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated. While he sat in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, two gunmen in scarves stormed the shop and cut him down in a hail of bullets, leaving one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime dead on the floor. The killing shocked the city and sent ripples through every Mafia family, and in the weeks that followed, rumors began circulating that the Gallo crew had been part of the hit. One story, repeated so many times it became folklore, claimed that Joe Gallo bragged about it to Sidney Slater, a Gallo gang member, saying with a grin, "You can call us the Barbershop Quintet." Whether said in jest, bravado, or not at all, the rumor caught wind, and it was largely accepted that the Gallos carried out the hit. The truth is still debated, and as you know, I try to remain unbiased, because I see my job as just a document, not to offer opinion, but I don't think Crazy Joe did it. What is accepted commonly is that Steve Arone, known as 14th Street Steve, was involved. So he was a member of Anastasia's family, and Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese had been plotting to assume their control in their respective families. So 14th Street Steve got the go-ahead. So whether he oversaw the hit and the Gallos were involved, or whether he carried out the hit with the alleged hit squad of Stephen Grammer and Arnold Wittenberg, is a debate for another day. But either way, it marked a turning point, because now the Gallo brothers, immediately after the Anastasia hit, the Gallo brothers shot onto the radar of Robert Kennedy. Practically overnight, they went from neighborhood toughs to national headlines, and Washington took notice. The McClellan Senate Committee on Racketeering, the same committee grilling Jimmy Hoffa, summoned them to Washington to testify. Joe, of course, treated the whole thing like theater. When he met Robert Kennedy for the first time, he glanced down at the elegant rug in Kennedy's office, then looked up with that slow, mischievous grin he was famous for. "Nice rug," he said. "It'd be perfect for a crap game." Kennedy didn't laugh, but everyone else in the hallway did. It was pure Crazy Joe, disrespectful, fearless, and playing to the cameras like he'd been born for the stage. And in true Joe Gallo fashion, he treated the whole hearing itself like a stage performance. He blew cigarette smoke at the reporters crowding around him and strutted into the hearing room with a smirk, playing the part of the unbothered gangster. His brother, Albert, sat beside him, rolling his eyes, knowing exactly how this would go. When the questioning began, Joey leaned into the microphone, kept his voice low and cold, and pleaded the Fifth Amendment again and again. "I respectfully declined to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me. Are you also known as a racketeer and gangster? I respectfully decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me. What labor organization or unions are you now associated with? I respectfully decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer may tend to incriminate." It was pure theater. Crazy Joe, straight out of Central Casting, giving America exactly the kind of gangster they feared and secretly loved to watch. Joe treated Washington like theater, but once he stepped off the train in Brooklyn, the tension waiting for him was real. Now embedded into the Profaci crime family, the boys from President Street, as they were now known, began to grow tired of their boss, Joe Profaci. They saw him as a weak, greedy, and outdated figure. Profaci's empire stretched across Brooklyn and Queens, combining legitimate olive oil and real estate holdings with a network of numbers, gambling, and labor rackets. He was a millionaire several times over, but still demanded tribute. A high tax on virtually every racket from loan sharking to vending machines, and anyone operating in his territory was expected to pay. At first, the Gallos complied. But as their profits grew, Joe began to chafe under the weight of Profaci's greed. "Any leader who taxes his men too heavily," Joe once said, "creates the conditions for rebellion." And by 1959, the Profaci family was rotting from within, and the conditions for rebellion were fertile. Soldiers grumbled about excessive tribute, and capos whispered about favoritism. Profaci promised lower-ranking members of the family, like the Gallos, of whom Joe and Larry were soldiers of progression, to capos and capo regimes. But then he only promoted relatives and childhood friends, keeping profits close and denying advancement to the men who had well been carrying out his dirty work. And his greed would soon mean that tension was about to reach a boiling point within the Preface crime family. Frankie Schatz was one of, if not the biggest earner in the Profaci family. We don't know the exact figures outside of his $2 million a year numbers racket, but it was suspected the loan sharking business wasn't far behind that number. And despite paying up the weekly tribute to Profaci, Profaci demanded more. Frankie Schatz quite rightly argued that he was paying enough, and refused to cough up more to the greedy Don, and that sealed his fate. On November the 4th, 1959, Frankie Schatz was ambushed outside the Cardiello Lounge at 2564th Avenue in Brooklyn, a tavern owned by his cousins, the Cardiellos, and a place that is still a restaurant and bar now. He was shot multiple times and later died in hospital. No witnesses came forward. Even the Cardiello brothers claimed they'd seen nothing, knowing what defying Profaci meant. But when the smoke cleared, Joe Profaci handed control of Frankie Schatz's lucrative rackets not to the Gallos, who in the event of Frankie's death had expected them, but to his brother-in-law and current family underboss, Joseph Magliocco. To Crazy Joe, it was the ultimate insult. Profaci had whacked the very man who took the boys from street level to the level they were at now. And not only that, Profaci had taken the rackets for himself. From that moment on, rebellion was inevitable. By March 1960, the tension had reached its breaking point. Joe, Larry, Albert, Joe Gioli, and Carmine Persico gathered one evening at the Longshore Restroom Room. They were the rising stars of the underworld, known collectively as the Barbershop Quintet for their rumored involvement in the Anastasia hit, but they were still treated like errand boys by their superiors. The conversation that night was quiet but dangerous. They spoke of a revolution, a coup within the Profaci family that would free them from the old man's taxes. Larry, always the realist, warned it couldn't work. Even if they killed Profaci, the commission would never allow a crew as young and as unstable as theirs to take over a family. But Joe, restless and angry, wasn't thinking politically. He wanted freedom, and he wanted power. Larry told him to wait, to bide their time. That one day they will kill Profaci and claim what is theirs, but for now it would be suicide. The rest of the crew agreed, and to calm his anger, Crazy Joe began to spend more time away from Brooklyn. By the dawn of the new decade in 1960, Joe Gallo was living in a different world from most mobsters. His own establishment, the Arpeggio Club at 144 East 52 Street, which is still an eatery today, became a gathering place for beatniks and gangsters alike, where Gallo would sit in the corner smoking hash with his Egyptian bodyguard and arms dealer, Hassan Wafer, or Ali Baba as he was known, and debating philosophy with writers and jazz musicians. It was clear that Joe was not just another violent hoodlum. Now, in his early 30s, there was something strangely cultured about him. He was drawn to the nightlife of Greenwich Village, where jazz, poetry, and rebellion blended into the pulse of the early 1960s. He devoured books, loved music, and had a deep affection with art. One night, Ali Baba took Joe to the San Remo Café, a smoky bohemian coffee house at the corner of Bleecker and McDougal Streets, the epicenter of the 1960s beat generation. The clientele there included Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, and the rest of the restless new thinkers of the post-war counterculture. For Joe, it was intoxicating, a world of ideas and rebellion that felt strangely familiar. One night at the San Remo, Gallo met Jeffy Lee Boyd, a former showgirl with dark skin, a taste for jazz, and a passion for books. Joe was instantly drawn to her. They shared long nights talking about nature, the psychology of Wilhelm Reich, and the blurred line between morality and survival. For Joe, who had always lived by instinct and danger, Jeffy represented something rare, understanding. She offered the kind of companionship he had never found in the underworld. Friends and mob associates were uneasy about the relationship. Tony Bender, who controlled much of the village's protection rackets, warned Joe not to marry Jeffy. "Keep her as your mistress," Bender said. But Joe ignored the advice. He was infatuated with her. The two married in late 1960 and almost immediately took off on a road trip to Miami, driving south through a changing America. A world of diners, neon signs, and roadside motels that symbolized a country on the edge of cultural revolution. As 1961 approached, the city of New York itself was changing. The jazz clubs of Greenwich Village hummed with new music. Civil rights marches were beginning, and the Mafia's old codes were starting to show cracks. But inside the Profaci family, the mood was anything but modern. Profaci still ruled like a feudal lord, rich, isolated, and increasingly paranoid. He had grown more reclusive, rarely leaving his massive estate in Long Island, protected behind iron fences and layers of loyal relatives. To the boys from President Street, Profaci was a dinosaur, clinging to power through greed and nepotism. To Profaci, the Gallos were reckless punks who needed to be reminded on who ruled New York's underworld. The clash was inevitable, and it would become one of the bloodiest internal wars in Mafia history. And as the spring of 1961 dawned, tensions within the Profaci crime family had reached a point of no return. Tribute payments had stopped, meetings were refused. Joe Gallo, once the golden boy of Brooklyn's underworld, had declared open defiance. And in the smoky bars and quiet alleys of President Street, the whispers began to spread. The Gallo were going to war. Larry had agreed, and now was the time for them to revolt. On the morning of February the 27th, 1961, in a move that stunned New York's underworld, the Gallo crew kidnapped 4 of the Profaci family's top figures: underboss Joseph Magliacco, Profaci's own brother Frank Profaci, capo Salvatore Musacchia, and soldier John Simone. The plan had been to seize Joe Profaci himself, but the old Don slipped away, fleeing to his Florida estate before the Gallos could reach him. And that detail mattered. Larry and Joe were soldiers, the lowest formally initiated rank in the Mafia hierarchy, yet they had just forced the boss of a Mafia family to run the length of the country to avoid them. Profaci commanded roughly 120 men. It was a fully developed crime family with decades of structure behind it. The Gallo had 25 men, most of them in their 20s and 30s. Yet the Profaci organization, with all its size, tradition, and supposed discipline, was the side running scared. No one in the underworld had ever seen anything quite like it. The idea that 2 soldiers could shake an entire crime family, paralyze its leadership, and send its boss into hiding was something veteran mobsters openly struggled to explain. It said everything about how dangerous the Gallo brothers had become, and how much fear Joe Gallo in particular inspired. And now that new nickname, Crazy Joe, didn't just suit him. It suddenly felt like an understatement. The hostages were taken to the Gallo stronghold at 51 President Street in Brooklyn, the same building where the brothers had built their vending and jukebox empire. Inside the cramped apartment, under flickering lights and the smell of cigarette smoke, the Gallos held their captives at gunpoint while demands were sent up the chain, and Cleo licked her lips at the thought of dinner. They wanted a larger cut of the family profits, control over Frankie Schatz's $2 million policy bank, and $150 in cash to settle what they had considered years of unfair tributes. For the first time in Mafia history, a crew had taken its own hierarchy hostage. Profaci, now hiding in Florida, turned to his allies on the commission, including Carlo Gambino, who was now the head of the commission, to mediate the crisis. The message was clear. There would be no bloodshed, at least not yet. The commission ordered a truce and promised that the dispute would be resolved peacefully, reluctantly. The Gallo released their hostages. But weeks passed, and in typical Profaci fashion, the promises went unfilled. The money never arrived. The reforms never came. Instead, Profaci bided his time and plotted revenge. Negotiations were reopened through John Simone, one of the men previously held hostage. Simone, a trusted Profaci loyalist, reached out to Larry Gallo with the pretense of reconciliation. He claimed to have good news, a peace offer in a suitcase full of cash. He invited Larry to meet him in South Brooklyn to discuss the deal. Larry agreed. He met Simone and accepted the suitcase, which indeed contained money. Simone then suggested they celebrate the renewed friendship with a drink at the Sahara Lounge, a dim bar at 1201 Utica Avenue in East Flatbush, and a known Profaci hangout. The 2 men sat at the bar. The place was quiet, only a bartender polishing glasses at the far end. They ordered drinks. Then Simone excused himself to use the restroom. Moments later, a garrote slipped around Larry's neck. The cord tightened, biting into his skin as he thrashed in his chair. His attacker was Salvatore D'Ambrosio, known as Sally D., a Profaci enforcer sent to finish the job. Standing nearby, watching the struggle, was none other than Carmine Persico. Once Larry's protege, now his betrayer. It might have ended there. Larry strangled to death in a Brooklyn bar, if not for pure chance. A patrolman unexpectedly entered the lounge just as the attack was underway. Sally D. and Persico bolted, punching the officer and shooting his partner outside before vanishing into the night. Miraculously, both Larry and the wounded policeman survived. At the 76th Precinct, Inspector Raymond Martin tried to persuade Larry to name his attackers, but Larry refused. "Nobody tried to kill me," he said flatly. It was an act of defiance that both honored the code and deepened the blood feud. From that day forward, Carmine Persico was branded with the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the Snake. And that summer, the killings began. In August 1961, one of the Gallos' closest confidants and most feared enforcers, Joe Gallo, vanished without a trace. Joe Gallo was Larry's bodyguard and one of the most efficient, unflinching hitmen operating on the streets, a man whose name alone could clear a room. For several days, the Gallos heard nothing. There was no phone call, no sighting, no word. Then, one afternoon, a car slowed to a crawl outside Jackie's Charcoal, the Gallo family diner. A rear door opened just long enough for someone to toss a brown paper parcel onto the pavement before the car sped off. Inside the package was Joe Gallo's neatly folded clothes, and wrapped inside them was a dead fish. The message was unmistakable. Joe Gallo sleeps with the fishes, a scene that was immortalized in the Godfather movie. Joe Gallo simply hadn't been murdered. He'd been dismembered, his arms and legs removed, and his remains stuffed into a large barrel before being dumped into Sheepshead Bay. The barrel floated back to the surface, forcing his killers, led by Sally D., to haul it up again and weigh it down further to ensure that it sank. The brutality was unmistakable. This wasn't just a murder. It was a message. And the Gallos, who already lived in a world where violence was the currency, suddenly understood that the Profaci were willing to escalate the war to levels that even Brooklyn wasn't accustomed to. The Gallo-Profaci War, which would later become known as the First Colombo War, had begun. A few days after Joe Gallo's clothes were found dumped outside of Jackie's, the message still hanging in the air like a threat, Crazy Joe, Larry, and Albert summoned every man they had to 51 President Street. No excuses, no delays. Once inside, the orders were absolute. No one was to leave the building without their permission. No one was to make a phone call, and no one was to be seen alone on the street. The tenement building became a fortress overnight. They stockpiled weapons until the rooms looked like an armory. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, and more than 15 Thompson submachine guns stacked against the walls. The Gallo crew was armed to the teeth, preparing for a siege they believed could come at any moment. Inside that cramped President Street building, Joey's grandmother and father cooked vast pots of spaghetti to feed the men, while neighbors slipped in with extra bread, blankets, and information. Kids on the block acted as lookouts, darting between stoops with word of soldiers cruising the neighborhood in dark Cadillacs. When a reporter spotted the 20-odd men clustered outside the tenement, Joe didn't bother hiding what was happening. "Yeah," he said casually. "There's a war on. We're hitting the mattresses." It was a throwaway line, but it stuck. From that moment on, hitting the mattresses became the phrase for mob crews going to ground, sleeping on floors, living side by side until the danger passed. Inside 51 President Street, which they began calling the dormitory. That's exactly what they did. The entire crew slept shoulder to shoulder on bare mattresses laid across the floorboards. Some men dozed, some polished weapons. Others stared out cracked windows, keeping watch over a street where every parked car, every unfamiliar face, could mean an ambush. They lived on coffee, cigarettes, and the spaghetti that Joey's grandmother kept ladling out of enormous pots, while the youngest kids in the neighborhood ran updates up the stoop like wartime couriers. Joey was right. There was a war on. And to be honest, calling it a war was almost an understatement. In early October 1961, Joseph Magnesco, known as Joey Maggs, the only other made man in the Gallo crew besides Joe and Larry, and a former soldier under Profaci, Harry Fontana, made a fatal mistake. Against the Gallos' explicit orders to stay inside the dormitory, he slipped out to meet his mother at the college restaurant at 224 4th Avenue. As he stepped out of the diner and onto the sidewalk, a gunman was waiting. It was Sally Fontana, the brother of Harry. Sally raised his weapon and fired 3 times. Joey Maggs collapsed in the street, gravely wounded, but still alive. When police arrived, a priest was summoned to administer the last rites on the pavement. Moments later, Joseph Magnesco, just 36 years old, died where he fell. The second major casualty in a war that was only just beginning. The retaliation came swiftly. In November 1961, Profaci hitman John Guarelia and Paul Rikishi were killed at the Hi-Fi Lounge at 72,000 and 13th Avenue in Bensonhurst, shot dead by Gallo members Michael Rizzitello and Punchy Alano. Then, a month later, a Profaci gunman disguised as a Wamertan opened fire on Larry Gallo's car. Larry survived unscathed, and then days later Carmine Persico found a bomb under his car. But fortunately for him, not for the Gallos, it didn't go off and was sorted out by the authorities. The war raged on, and now the Gallos, who were no longer collecting on Tough Tony, due to the fact that, well, they claim they killed his brother, or Frankie shots his numbers business as Persico and Profaci had claimed that for themselves, the Gallo were in need of cash. While Larry built vending routes where Profaci hitmen would not find them and balanced the ledgers, Joe looked to shake down a local businessman, a man named Teddy Moss, of whom no photographs have survived of. But basically, Moss was the owner of a small check-cashing service and 3 Brooklyn taverns, and when Joe tried to extort him, Moss went to the police. In the middle of a gang war, Joe was arrested and now faced a potential 14-year sentence. In court, Moss testified that Joe had tried to seize his check-cashing business, and the judge handed down the maximum sentence, 7 to 14 years in Attica prison. As the verdict was read, Jeffy Gallo, who was heavily pregnant at that point and already worn thin by months of the gang war, broke down in tears. Joe slipped an arm around her and murmured, "Don't worry, it'll be all right." But nothing about the moment was all right, because while Brooklyn simmered in a gang war and his brothers fought one of the most powerful mafia families in America, the Gallo crew had just lost their most feared enforcer. And Crazy Joe was now headed to prison for a long stretch, leaving his brothers to survive without him. By the end of 1961, the Gallo-Profaci war had left Brooklyn shaken. The Mafia Commission was furious. Profaci's greed had created a rebellion, and Joe Gallo's defiance had turned it into a spectacle. Newspapers ran daily updates, and for the first time, the American public saw organized crime as a messy, human, and violent civil war. Then on January the 31st, 1962, something happened that no one could have predicted. Smoke was seen pouring from a third-floor window at 73 President Street, just a few doors down from the dormitory. A mattress had caught fire inside the top-floor apartment, quickly filling it with a thick, black smoke. Without hesitation, Larry and several of the crew sprinted towards the building. Inside the choking heat, they dragged out 6 children, the youngest an infant, the oldest no more than 6. Larry carried a 5-year-old girl whose hair had already begun to singe. Albert wrapped the naked baby in his jacket and shielded her from the smoke. Others tore the burning mattress apart, dousing it with water from pots, pans, and buckets they grabbed from neighbors. By the time 3 fire trucks screeched onto the block, the blaze was already out, extinguished not by firefighters, but by the very men the newspapers had spent years calling killers. The children's mother, Cecilia Baz, returned from the grocery store to find her home ruined, but her children alive. She dropped her shopping bags right there on the sidewalk and began to cry. "They saved my children," she told the reporters gathering around her. "They're wonderful boys. God bless them." When the cameras turned towards the Gallos, Albert tried to push the attention away. "Don't make heroes out of us," he said. "We're not heroes. We just did what any red-blooded American boys would do. You see any horns here? I ain't got no horns. We're not animals. We're just human beings trying to get along." The story made national headlines within hours. Housewives sent cookies and handwritten letters. Church groups thanked the Gallos for their bravery. Even the FBI, in a memo to J. Edgar Hoover, warned that considerable favorable publicity concerning the Gallo brothers is expected to result. Subject should be considered armed and dangerous. Life magazine ran a piece with the headline, "All righty already. The mob is heroes. In the middle of a brutal mafia war, the Gallos had accidentally become household names, the gangsters who pulled children from a burning building. They were no longer just villains. They were something stranger, something the public couldn't resist. The outlaw brothers of President Street, the charming killers who saved 6 kids from a fire, the crew who defied their own boss in the law and somehow walked away looking like legends. But behind the headlines, the war was far from over. Profaci's health was failing, and new alliances were forming in the shadows. The truce was temporary. The wounds were deep. And Joe Gallo, now behind the walls of Attica, was already planning his next move. By the spring of 1962, South Brooklyn was worn thin. After a year of kidnappings, attempted hits, ambushes, and disappearances, the whole neighborhood carried itself differently. People talked a little quieter. Shopkeepers closed earlier. Priests kept an eye on who lingered outside the church steps. Even traffic on Columbia and President Street seemed to slow, not because the lights changed, but because drivers were afraid of ending up between 2 passing cars full of gunmen. Nobody knew who would get hit next. Nobody wanted to be standing near them when it happened. The Gallo-Profaci feud had turned daily life into a kind of strange routine. Open your shop, mind your business, keep your head down, and hope today wasn't the day that bullets started flying again. The Gallo-Profaci conflict had divided families, emptied corner bars after dark, and taught children to identify the sound of a .38 against the echo of a car backfiring. In March 1962, a sedan on a Brooklyn avenue took a sudden burst of shots. The target was Salvatore Profaci, son of Joe. The bullets missed, but the message reached its destination. If the old man would not step down, the young would bleed in his place. Finally, the commission intervened. The bosses could see that the war was drawing heat, and heat crushed business. Quiet emissaries moved between apartments and back rooms, and the word came down that there would be peace. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, merely the absence of gunfire long enough for Brooklyn to breathe. If peace required humiliation, then the younger men would swallow it, at least in public. Larry Gallo would have to sit across from Carmine Persico, and their handshake, however brittle, would be accepted as binding by the men on the rooftops and the men waiting in Cadillacs. The brothers complied, but Larry refused to leave President Street. He didn't trust truce or ceremony. He felt the wire bite his throat, and he'd watched the garrote tighten in a dim lounge. He understood that with Profaci, peace meant nothing, so he stayed. The dormitory is fortress and family hearth. His father Umberto cooking spaghetti in the kitchen. His brother Albert drifting between front stoop and upstairs windows. The neighborhood children still slipping in to relay information. President Street continued to be their fortress.